Okay, thank you everybody for coming tonight. Um, it's great to see so many people coming out again this week. For those of you who were not here last week, uh, I am Catherine Dale. I am the coordinator of the Breeding Bird Atlas. And with me tonight, we have Jenna McDermott, who is the assistant coordinator, and we also have our intern, Isabel. So Jenna and Isabel are going to be monitoring the chat and helping to answer some questions while I give tonight's presentation, which is all about our seabirds, gulls, and terns here in Newfoundland. Jenna and I, and Isabel for the moment, work for an organization called Birds Canada. Here we go, my slides are now advancing. And the mission of Birds Canada is to drive action to advance the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats. So we're the leading science-based bird conservation organization in the country. And we work to carry out this mission, which is a pretty big mission to carry out, through strong science and establishing innovative partnerships with other organizations, but also largely through working with citizen scientists. So citizen scientists are people just like you who participate in our programs across the country each year. And this is always kind of a mind-blowing number to me, but every year, more than 70,000 volunteers across Canada participate in one or more of Birds Canada's programs. We are relative newcomers to Newfoundland, so we only established an office here in Newfoundland in 2018, 2019. And at the moment, we run two major programs here. And the first is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. If you'd like to learn about this in detail, I'm not going to go too much in depth tonight, but there will be a webinar specifically about the Atlas and how you can participate in it on April 8th this year. But in short, what this is a massive citizen science effort to map the distribution and the abundance of all species of birds breeding on the island of Newfoundland. So the map that you can see there is for the Atlantic puffin, and each of those little colored squares indicate places where puffins have been found breeding. You can see there aren't that many of them, but the two areas that are highlighted are places that we know that puffins breed. So on the Avalon, you can see the Witless Bay colony, and then on the Bonavista Peninsula, you can see the Elliston puffin colony. The other project that we run here in Newfoundland is the Atlantic Nocturnal Owl Survey. So what that is a survey that we conduct each spring between the 1st of April and the 15th of May. And it involves citizen scientists going out to a predetermined route. It's composed of 10 stops. Each of them are 2 kilometers apart. And you drive along this roadside route, stop at each of the 10 stops, and play a track that combines owl playback and silence. And you listen and report what you hear. So this is a really great survey for beginner birders because we don't have that many species of nocturnal owls here in Newfoundland. And if you're interested in learning more about that, we also have a webinar specifically about the Atlantic Nocturnal Owl Survey and about the owls of Newfoundland, and that will be on March the 4th. And for those of our participants who are here in Newfoundland, we're also going to be doing a little bit of traveling around the island to deliver owl presentations in person. So if you happen to live in Harbour Grace or Clarenville or close to either of those, we're going to be holding in-person owl talks there within the next few weeks. And you can find out when on our social media or on our website. And if you live elsewhere on the island, but think that your community might like an in-person owl presentation, please get in touch with us. We're really looking to get the word out about the owl survey and to increase participation in it. But for both of these programs, anyone is welcome to participate. There is room for people of all different birding experience levels. And if you're interested, come out to our webinars and get in touch with us. Now, before we get going, we have a few people to thank. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of our supporters and sponsors. The Atlas in particular is a massive collaborative effort. And without the support of all of these funders, of all of these partners, we would not be able to complete the projects that we're working on here. We wouldn't be able to offer workshops like the ones we're offering tonight. I would also like to acknowledge that the lands that we have these programs on are the ancestral homelands of Beothuk people who have been erased forever. And the island of Newfoundland is the unceded traditional territory of Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq people. And these people have been protecting and stewarding the land here since time immemorial. And through our work with the Breeding Bird Atlas and the Nocturnal Owl Survey, we hope to assist this stewardship in protecting all the species that we share this island with. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about seabirds, and there are lots and lots of species to cover here in Newfoundland. So just to give you a brief outline, I'm going to start by talking about what are seabirds. Answer is not as simple as you might think. I'm going to talk about why seabirds are an important thing to consider here in Newfoundland, and then we're going to go through all of the species that can breed here on the island. And we're also going to finish off today with one of our trademark little quizzes. So we always finish our bird ID webinars with a short little poll-based quiz. Don't worry, the answers are anonymous. We're just interested to give you an opportunity to put your new skills to use. Okay, so what is a seabird? It's also known as a pelagic or a marine bird, but it turns out there isn't actually a formal scientific definition. So you won't look in your field guide and find a section called seabirds. And in fact, scientists can't even necessarily agree on which bird families should be included in the definition. So I like this quote: "The one common characteristic that all seabirds share is that they feed in saltwater, but as seems to be true with any statement in biology, some don't." This is very true. So there are a lot of different groups of birds that use saltwater habitats, but not all of them are actually considered true seabirds either. So things like loons, grebes, sea ducks, herons, and shorebirds, they all use salt water a lot, but we don't consider them seabirds. So then what exactly is a seabird? There are some general characteristics that most of them do seem to share. So overall, these are birds that are well adapted for life in the ocean and make their living primarily from the ocean. So they tend to have dense, waterproof feathers. There is actually an exception to that we'll talk about today. They tend to have layers of fat. The ocean is cold, so they need to stay warm. They also live in salt water, so most of them have a desalination system to remove excess salt from their bodies. Most of them have webbed feet, much more effective in water. And their body shape reflects their lifestyle. So not all seabirds share the same body shape. So if you look at the puffin down here in the right corner, and then you look at the albatross at the top right corner, you can see they don't share the same body type at all. So you have lots of seabirds have these chunky bodies with short wings. They're not great for long distance flying, but they're really good for diving, and they're good for cold northern waters. So those are species like the puffin. Then you have things like shearwaters and albatrosses, which have really long, slender wings that are good for collecting prey from the ocean surface, so just sort of skimming. And these tend to be better in warmer waters. Seabirds are also incredibly long-lived, so they're really good examples of very long-lived bird species. So one really famous example is Wisdom, the Laysan albatross, who is the world's oldest known banded wild bird. He's more than 70 years old. She is more than 70 years old now. So she has been laying eggs and raising young every year in the Hawaiian archipelago since at least the 1950s. So she could be even older than 70. She was banded in 1956, but she's quite an aged bird. And because they have such long lives, seabirds also tend to have delayed breeding. So unlike many of our smaller perching birds, which hatch one summer and are back to breed the next summer, seabirds often won't breed until 5 or even 10 years of age. And this long life and delayed breeding may actually be an evolutionary adaptation for life in the ocean environment, which is really, really variable. And so by having delayed breeding, it gives them several years to figure out how to forage prey in different seasons, which is really important if you want to successfully reproduce. And then on top of that, it gives them many chances at successful reproduction. Unlike, again, many of our smaller perching birds, which have really large broods, so can have 5 or 6 eggs, seabirds tend to have fewer chicks. Many of them just have 1 egg. So I'm really excited to talk about Newfoundland seabirds today because they are one of the reasons this island is famous. So Newfoundland is known as the seabird capital of North America. We have 29,000 kilometers of coastline here, and that coastline provides essential habitat for more than 35 million seabirds. So Newfoundland has the largest colony of Atlantic puffins in North America, and that is more than 300,000 breeding pairs of Atlantic puffins. And we have the largest colony of Leach's storm petrels, which is a bird you may not be familiar with, but hopefully you will be by the end of this webinar. We have the largest colony of leach's storm petrels in the entire world, and that's more than 3 million breeding pairs of leach's storm petrels. In fact, 6 of our wilderness and ecological reserves, which is what you can see on that map there, the little boxes indicate those. 6 of ours are designated specifically for seabirds, and that includes Witless Bay, which is just off the coast of the Avalon, and that's where our largest puffin colony is. And then Baccalieu Island, which is also just off the tip of the Avalon, and that is where the largest colony of storm petrels is. So these are the birds that we're going to go through today. Little bit of a disclaimer here. This applies to all of our webinars. We had to do a little bit of selection in terms of which species we were going to cover. Otherwise, we would all be here for a very, very long time. So today we have chosen to focus on birds that actually breed here in Newfoundland. And that's largely because we do run a breeding bird atlas. And so these are the birds that we are most familiar with and most interested in. These are also the birds that really depend on Newfoundland. So they're important to consider when you're talking about seabirds in Newfoundland, or sorry, seabirds in general. There are a couple on this list that don't actually breed here. Those are shown in gray. So the Wilson storm petrel and the dovekey we are going to touch on briefly. The photos that we show you, for the most part, are going to be of birds in breeding plumage. So most species of birds molt or replace their feathers once or twice a year. And in birds that molt twice a year, they may actually look very different during the breeding season than at other times of year. But again, we are a breeding bird atlas. You're most likely to see seabirds during the breeding season because that's when they come to land. And it's often when birds are the most distinctive. So it's a really good place to start if you're trying to learn your bird ID. And with that out of the way, let's go through our species. And we're going to start with the northern fulmar. So at first glance, you might think that this guy is a bit like a gull, but maybe a gull that needs to go on a little bit of a diet. So this is a stocky, gull-like seabird, and it belongs to a family called Procellariformes. I always mess that one up. So that includes our albatrosses and also our petrels. And basically it means tube noses. So you can see here on his bill, the nostrils are enclosed in tubes. And he's got a very straight bill with that tube on top that's hooked a little bit at the end. And that tube nose contributes to the highly developed sense of smell in these birds. So they actually use their sense of smell to find prey on the ocean surface. We don't tend to think of birds as being particularly good at smelling, but these guys are exceptions. These guys drink salt water as well, and they excrete the salt through a nasal gland at the base of the bill. So it actually kind of drips out of the bill. Other cues when you're looking to identify a northern fulmar. You've got straight, stiff wings. You've got a very thick neck. So, take note of just how thick that neck is when comparing it to, say, something like a gull. There's a bit of a dark eye smudge there. There's a short, thick, yellowish bill and a short gray tail. However, just to complicate things, I should also say that there are multiple color morphs of northern fulmar. So the previous guy is nice white with just a little tinge of gray on the wings. This guy is much grayer overall. So northern fulmars can vary in color from dark gray to nearly white. This can be difficult when attempting to ID them, but happily they do have those features that will always stand out. So the tube nose, the nice thick neck, the stiff straight wings, those are really good cues. Northern fulmars are opportunistic feeders, and they really like to scavenge discards from fishing boats. So they've been growing, their range has been growing substantially. So those of you who were at Jenna's webinar last week will remember these range maps. This is a range map for the northern fulmar in North America. They're actually a worldwide bird. But here you'll see that they've got pretty big range, and that may partly be due to the expansion of commercial fisheries. So in Newfoundland in particular, they were first recorded here in the 1960s. So we didn't have any record of fulmars here, northern fulmars here before that. They're now common, and they're common year-round. So you can see that purple around the island of Newfoundland shows that they're around here all year. And then we do have some breeding colonies, so at Cape St. Mary's, Witless Bay, and Funk Island. Okay, and so we've got another little tiny tube nose bill here. Uh, this is the Leach's storm petrel, and it may be the most common seabird that you've never heard of or seen. So Leach's storm petrel are the most abundant seabird in eastern Canada, but they spend their entire lives out at sea except for when they're breeding. So you may think you'd see them when they're breeding, but we still don't see them very much because they breed in burrows. So they dig burrows out, they lay their nests at the end of the burrows, and they only come to and from those burrows at night in the dark to avoid predators. So they're quite difficult to see. They're about the size of a robin, so it makes them the smallest member of the tube-nosed family, and they only weigh about 50 grams. But kind of mind-blowingly, these little 50-gram birds will travel up to 1,200 kilometers offshore to find food during the breeding season. So that is a lot of travel for a very small bird. Storm petrels can be a little bit tricky. So many species of storm petrels look really alike. And in fact, the group is one of those known for having what are called cryptic species. So that is different species that look so much alike, it's pretty much impossible for us to tell them apart in the field. But then when you take their blood and you have a look at their genetics, it turns out they're extremely dissimilar. So petrels are definitely hard to identify. The ID cues for Leach's storm petrel, which is the only storm petrel that breeds here in Newfoundland, are in particular the notched tail you can see there. So you've got almost a forked tail, you've got nice short legs, and you've got a pale bar that reaches the leading edge of the wing. Now they are quite small, so you might not be able to see the tube nose in the field, but if it's close enough that you can see that, that's an excellent cue as well. And then they do have long arched wings. There really isn't much that you could confuse a Leach's storm petrel with here in Newfoundland, except maybe the Wilson storm petrel. And if you look at the pattern of the Wilson storm petrel, you'll see that superficially, these species look pretty alike. However, there are a few key differences. So one is, remember I said the pale bar on the wings of the Leach's storm petrel goes all the way to the edge of the wings? On the Wilson storm petrel, it doesn't. So you can see that dark spot at the end of the long pale bar. Another cue, the Leach's storm petrel has that forked tail, whereas the Wilson storm petrel has a blunt tail. So it's relatively straight. And then Leach's storm petrels have really short legs. Wilson storm petrels have quite long legs. And so if you see the bird flying and the legs extend past the end of the tail, it's a Wilson storm petrel. All of these cues are really useful, but something else to keep in mind, again, if you were at Jenna's talk last week, remember she talked about context. Well, turns out that Wilson storm petrels breed in Antarctica. So this is a range map for them, and you can just see the breeding range in sort of a pinkish color down there along the edges of Antarctica. So we really only see them when they're not breeding. And when seabirds aren't breeding, they don't come into land very much. So any storm petrel that you see on or close to land in Newfoundland is probably a Leach's storm petrel. You will see Wilsons. Of course, the Antarctic summer is our winter, so we do actually get them up here during the breeding season, but they'll be farther offshore. And I just wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about petrels and what's going on with them. So one of the things that I love about studying birds and working with birds is just all of this interesting background information. So as I mentioned, Newfoundland is home to the largest breeding colony of Leach's storm petrels in the world on Baccalieu Island off the Avalon Peninsula. But in fact, when you total all of the colonies here in Newfoundland, so you total the number, we may actually be home to as much as 50% of the global population of Leach's storm petrels. So in 1985, that largest colony on Baccalieu Island had a population of 6.6 million birds. And then when other colonies were counted nearby, they added another 1.4 million petrels to that total. So we have a lot of petrels here. However, when people went back to survey those same colonies 20 to 30 years later, they got much smaller numbers. And in fact, the numbers that they got indicated a 40 to 50% population decline. So we're talking about 3.3 million storm petrels that just aren't there anymore. And so it's not just here that we're seeing breeding populations plummeting, it's all across the Atlantic. And a lot of researchers are working on trying to figure out what is going on with these petrels. Why are we losing them so very quickly? And what they've figured out so far is that chick survival, so from the time an egg hatches to when the chick leaves the nest, that's actually very high. That's almost 100%. If the egg hatches, there's a very, very good chance that the fledgling is going to leave the nest. However, adult survival is only 80% from year to year. So there's only an 80% chance that a bird returns to its breeding colony the next year. And that sounds not so bad, actually, but for its long-lived seabird, that's extremely low. So the problem seems to be with adult survival. And there are 4 hypotheses explaining why this might be happening, why we see such low adult survival. One possibility is predation in burrows, but that doesn't seem incredibly likely because chick survival is so high. You would expect that both chicks and adults would be affected by that. Oh, I forgot, I have a nice graph showing the massive decline in storm petrel populations. So it's probably not predation in burrows. So it could be a lack of food resources. And this may be a reflection of the distribution of fish populations shifting with climate change. And so places where the birds were foraging before are no longer good places to forage. Pollution is another possibility. So things like mercury and plastic particles. We know that plastic is everywhere. And then the last idea being studied is artificial light attraction. So think about things like our offshore oil platform. That emits a fantastic amount of light. If you look at a map of the world at night, you can actually see the light being emitted from our offshore oil platforms. And it's possible that petrels that are flying by are attracted to that light and that results in their death. So there's all kinds of research going on right now. I can't give you an answer to this. People are still looking into it, including members of Bill Montebecchi's lab here at Memorial University. But if you're interested in learning a little bit more about it, there are a couple recorded webinars on our website, one by Laura Tranquilla and one by Sydney Collins, which have a lot more detail about what's going on with storm petrels. Okay, so we will move on to our next seabird species, from the smallest to the biggest. This is a northern gannet, and this is probably our most recognizable seabird. And certainly anyone who has been to Cape St. Mary's here in Newfoundland will recognize these guys. So these are the largest breeding seabirds in the North Atlantic. And the adults have extremely distinctive plumage. So they've got that nice yellowish head. They've got a bill like a dagger. They've got white primaries, so the inner part of their wings is white, and then they've got black wingtips, really defined black wingtips. They travel really long distances to forage, so they're a common sight all along the coasts of Newfoundland, but they nest in huge colonies on cliff sides. And so if you look closely at that map there, you'll see that within the pink breeding range, there are 6 distinct circles. And so those are the 6 breeding colonies in North America. We have 3 in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and 3 along the coast of Newfoundland. And Cape St. Mary's, here on the southern tip of the Avalon, is the southernmost and the most accessible. So there are about 30,000 northern gannets that nest there. And for anyone who hasn't been but is in Newfoundland or planning a trip to Newfoundland, it is absolutely worth it. It's one of my favorite places here on the island. Gannets are awesome in many, many ways. But one of the coolest things about them is how they feed. So they perform these incredibly precise dives, and they hit the ocean at about 100 kilometers an hour. And as you can see in that photo there, it's not a great photo, but it's very, very hard to catch them because it happens so quickly. They hit the ocean, and they're just amazing to see. The precision with which they dive is really quite mind-blowing. Now, of course, birds are never easy. So a little detail about northern gannets. The adults have that extremely distinctive plumage. You can see the adults blurred out there in the lower right of the picture, but the juveniles and the immatures are a little bit trickier because they're dark in color, and then they slowly become white over a period of 4 to 5 years. And so this has led to some confusion. We don't really have anything else that breeds here regularly that's the size and shape of a gannet. However, we do have some rare and unusual birds that show up occasionally. For example, a few years ago, we had a brown booby that was spotted here. And a lot of people, when the sighting was first reported, thought that that was actually likely an immature gannet, but it turned out it was in fact a brown booby, and everybody was very excited. Okay, so we went smallest, the biggest, and now we are without doubt at the least popular. So this is the double-crested cormorant, and it is one of the most hated birds in the world, unfortunately, so it has a major reputation issue. Here in Newfoundland and in a number of other places, it's known as a shag. It's often seen in this posture that you see here because it's spreading its wings to dry out its feathers. So remember I said that not all seabirds have waterproof feathers? Double-crested cormorant is a seabird that doesn't. So they don't produce as much preen oil as other seabirds, and so their feathers actually get soaked through when they die rather than shedding water like a duck. But there is some thought that getting wet feathers may actually make it easier for the cormorants to hunt underwater. So they're really good divers. They're very good at catching fish. So ID cues for the double-crested cormorant. You've got that nice long hooked bill, and then you've got orange at the base of the bill and the chin. So some of that is bill and some of that is actually skin. You've got that long snake-like almost neck with a black throat, bright blue eyes in there, and then it's pretty much black all over with a green or a bronze sheen and a nice long tail. We do have one other species of cormorant that we do get here in Newfoundland, and that is the great cormorant. It's very similar in shape to the double-crested cormorant. You can also see it's got the same blue, black feathers with that sort of bronzy sheen to them. Great cormorants are bigger than double-crested cormorants. They're bigger and stockier. But as Jenna mentioned last week, size is really only a useful cue in IDing birds when you've got the two of them standing together. So if you had a great cormorant standing beside a double-crested cormorant, it would be really easy to see the size difference. If you don't, though, there's one really good cue you can use, and that is the white cheeks and throat. So they've got this area of white plumage at the base of their bill that double-crested cormorants do not have. They also have a white spot on their flank. So in this picture, the guy's wing is covering it up, but there is a second white spot there, which is quite evident in flight. And so these white spots are a cue that it is not a double-crested cormorant you're seeing. Some of you might also wonder about the double-crested cormorant's name. I did when I first learned it. They do actually, when they're breeding, have these little tufts on either side of their head. So this is where his name comes from, double-crested cormorant. But of course, it's often very, very difficult to see those tufts. They're actually you're quite unlikely to see them. So they're not the most useful identifying cue. Another thing to keep in mind, again, this context piece, great cormorants are much less common here in Newfoundland, and double-crested cormorants are the only species likely to be seen inland, away from the coast. So if we look at our range maps again here, you can see the double-crested cormorants can be found all across North America, but great cormorants are really restricted to the shorelines. Okay, now we are moving on to the auk family. So this is the family Alcidae, and it's the same family as the extinct great auk. So they are superficially similar to penguins. They all share this black and white color scheme and kind of an upright posture. But all of our extant auks, so anything that isn't extinct, does actually fly. The extinct great auk did not fly. So we're going to start here with the common murre, which is called a tur here in Newfoundland. And these guys nest in colonies on steep cliffs. So I've mentioned Cape St. Mary's a few times. It's a huge gannet colony, but it's also a really good place to look to find these guys, the common murres. So identifying cues for them, you've got that black and white color scheme, so a white breast and belly, and then sort of a black-brown head, neck, back, and wings. They do have a thin line of white tips on their secondary wing feathers, so you can just see there that thin line of white on the wings. And they have a long, thin bill. Now, when a Newfoundlander says that they're going out tur hunting, for example, they might mean common murres, but we have another species of murre, which maybe a little bit confusingly is also called a tur here in Newfoundland. And that is the thick-billed murre. So it looks very similar to the common murre. They've got the same long, slender bill, same upright posture, black and white coloration, but they do have basically what looks like a milk mustache. So they've got that thin white line on their upper bill, which is diagnostic for these guys. And then if you look a little bit closer, you can also see a difference in what it looks like where the white of the breast and belly meets the black of the neck. So on thick-billed murres, it comes to a really sharp point, and you can see the white comes up onto their neck and ends in that sharp point. But if we look back at our common murre, you can see that it's more of straight line, and their necks are almost entirely black. So that's a really good way to distinguish between the two species. Okay, so we have our common murres and we have our thick-billed murres. Nowhere did I mention anybody who looks like this. So who is this? I don't have a poll for this, but if anybody wants to throw it in the chat, I'd be interested to know what people think. What have we got here? Razorbill, good guess, good guess. We're not quite at razorbills yet, but anybody else have a guess for what we might have here? Dovekey, breeding murre. These are all good guesses. So dovekies and razorbills are other species of ox. Breeding murre, it probably is a breeding murre. Okay, somebody has put bridled common murre. We've got 2 people putting bridled common murre, and that is exactly right. So basically here in the North Atlantic, we have 2 different forms of the common murre. Some of them don't have that white around the eye and then stretching down the back of the head and neck, which is called a bridle. And then some of them do have the bridle. So it seems to be, this bridling actually seems to be associated with cold adaptation. So the frequency of bridling, that is what percent of the population has one of these bridles, corresponds with sea surface temperature. So when we have higher sea surface temperatures, we don't have as many bridled murres, and at colder temperatures, we have more bridled murres. And people have actually done survival analyses of this, which indicates that murres that are unbridled, their survival increases at warmer temperatures, but in bridled birds, you see exactly the opposite pattern. So survival decreases at warmer temperatures and increases at colder temperatures. So it's really cool. You're probably wondering why on earth bridling would have anything to do with thermal tolerance. And it turns out that it may not have anything to do with thermal tolerance, but somebody that I actually went to grad school with studied bridling in murres. And what she found is that the gene that seems to affect bridling possibly is right beside a gene for thermal tolerance. And so they may be connected in that way. So it's a really cool little story about polymorphism, so birds having different forms and both being present in the same population. But keep in mind that if you see a bridled murre, it's definitely common. Thick-billed murres do not have bridling like that. Okay, and our next bird, somebody mentioned the razorbill. This is absolutely one of my favorite Newfoundland birds. It's also an auk. You can see the same white breast and belly, black head, neck, and back. One of the reasons I love these guys so much is they are called tinkers in Newfoundland. And I wasn't quite sure why, but it turns out that it's a local pronunciation of thinker, because when they're courting each other, they will actually stare up at the sky. So they'll hold their bill vertically and stare up in the air, looking like they're contemplating the heavens. The big thing you're looking for as terms of an IDQ in razorbills is that huge, thick bill. They've got a horizontal white line from the eye to the base of the bill, and then they've got a vertical white line on the bill. But you'll notice there's a big difference between that bill and the thin, sharp, pointed bills of the murres. Again, they do have the same coloration. They've got the same line of white tips on their wing feathers. So just a difference in how stocky they are. And you're less likely to see them in these massive colonies that you see the murres in. Somebody else mentioned guillemots, another one of my favorite Newfoundland birds. So they are an alcid, they're an auk. A little bit of a variation on the color scheme here, because you can see that they're actually black all over, with the exception of those white wing patches and then the wonderful red feet that they have. So these guys nest on rocky coastlines, and they can get they can come together in pretty large colonies, particularly in the Arctic. So you can see about 10,000 pairs of these guys in the Arctic. You're not going to see them breeding in numbers like that here. So IDQs for these guys, the white wing patches, the red feet and legs. They've got that thin, sharp bill, a black breast and belly. They're smaller than the other auks that we've talked about so far. Cornell University, which has some great bird descriptions, describes them as pot-bellied. I think that's a little bit rude, but they are kind of smaller and rounder. And the inside of their mouth, when they open it up, it actually matches their feet. So it's bright red. Okay, and next we have another auk. This one doesn't really need an introduction because this is Newfoundland's most iconic bird, known as sea parrot and hatchet face here. And as I said, Newfoundland is home to the biggest breeding colony in North America. So half of North America's population is found at the breeding colony in Lucas Bay. Many of you may know that puffins nest in burrows like storm petrels. And they actually, both puffins and storm petrels, do experience some problems with their young being attracted to artificial light. So when young puffins and young petrels fledge from their burrow for the first time, they're supposed to follow the light of the moon out to sea. However, because we now have coastlines that are lit up with artificial light, many of them do actually get lost and they head the wrong direction. They head inland and then they have trouble taking off again. And that is why here in Newfoundland, we have what is called the Puffin and Petrel Patrol, which is run by the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. So every August, volunteers go out at night with nets and they scoop up lost puffins and petrels, bring them back to the headquarters, and then the next day they are taken out to sea and released there. It's a lot of fun to volunteer for that project if you have the opportunity to do so. Don't really need too many ID cues for the Atlantic puffin. There's really nothing else like it here. So there are 3 puffin species: horned puffins, tufted puffins, and Atlantic puffins. But horned and tufted puffins are only found in the Pacific. So they've got black upper parts, white underparts, short straight wings, orange legs, and then they've got that colorful parrot-like bill. And that bill actually grows larger and acquires more groups as the bird ages. However, it's also worth noting that the bill loses the outer colorful plates in winter. So it becomes less triangular, shrinks a little bit, and the face overall becomes grayer. So they don't have quite the same wonderful clown-like appearance during the winter, and juveniles actually have all dark bills. Okay, and I think this is the last of our auks, and this is also the smallest of the alcids. But it is, in fact, the most abundant in the North Atlantic. So when we talked about the guillemots, we talked about it being pot-bellied. Cornell describes these guys, dovekies, as flying billiard balls with wings, which is actually not a bad description. So here you see the same color scheme as you saw with the other alcids. So you've got the dark back and the white underneath. But the big caveat here is if you were to see a dovekey here in Newfoundland, that's not actually what it would look like. So dovekies actually breed much further north in the Canadian Arctic, and so we only see them in our waters here in Newfoundland in the winter. And during the winter, they look like that photo on the right there. So they've still got black upper parts, they've got the same little short bill, they basically don't have any neck at all. They've got white underparts, but that white underpart really extends up onto the cheek and almost all the way to the top of the head. They've also got almost no tail, so no tail, no neck. Here they are nicknamed bullbirds. They're wonderful little birds to see, but we won't find them breeding here. Okay, so we're actually moving through these pretty quickly. I thought we might have trouble covering them all, but these are in fact the last 8 species that we're going to cover tonight. So we're going to talk now about our gulls and our terns. And again, I'm just going to bring back that disclaimer that we are focusing on those species that actually breed here. And with gulls, it's particularly important to say that we are focusing on adults, not juveniles or immatures, and not what their plumage looks like in the winter. So winter gulls are far more complicated than we have time to get into tonight. You can sort of see their plumage change both with year and with summer and winter. So you can get things like a second cycle winter plumage gull. So Nature Newfoundland and Labrador sometimes does a workshop all focused on winter gulls. And if it's something that you're interested in seeing, I don't think they're doing it this year, but you should certainly let them know that it would be something that people would have interest in seeing in the future. Okay, so the first of the gulls, the black-legged kittiwake, also called a tickle ace here. So this is the third species that breeds in large numbers at Cape St. Mary's. And unlike what we think of most of the time when we think of gulls, they don't scavenge food or forage at dumps. So these guys eat mostly small fish and marine invertebrates. And they nest, as you can kind of see in that picture, right on the cliff face. So these are our smallest gull here. They're smaller than either ring-billed or herring gulls. They're quite tiny. They've got a narrow yellow-green bill. They've got light gray wings and back with black wingtips. And then, as you probably would guess from their name, they have black legs and feet. So that is a little bit difficult to see, but that bird is standing on the nest. And if you look, you can see a little bit of black there at the bottom, and that's his feet. So the color of legs and feet is actually really important to pay attention to when you're dealing with gulls. I did say that we're not going to talk about the plumage of immatures, but I will just talk briefly about what young black-legged kittiwakes look like, because you see them in such huge numbers at some of the colonies. So they look pretty different than the adults, but these guys are actually extremely distinct and easy to recognize. So the juveniles have a little black bill. They have that little dark spot behind the eye, almost like they were putting on black blush but missed their cheek by a little bit. They have a black band on the back of the neck, and then a black tail tip, and they have black on their wings that when they fly actually forms an M in flight. So that's a really diagnostic cue. It takes them 3 years to go from this plumage to adult plumage. Okay, our next species is the black-headed gull, which, as you can see, actually has a brown head, so it's a little bit misnamed. And this is a really common old world gull, so it's a Eurasian gull, but it is known to winter on the coast of North America and is, in fact, a rare breeder here in Newfoundland. And so you can actually find it breeding on the West Coast specifically, in the Stephenville area, on small islands off the coast. These guys are ground nesters, and they tend to nest with other gulls and terns. So you'd be looking in a large crowd of gulls to find them. As I said, they have a sort of brownish black hood, not a black head entirely. They've got a bright red bill, and they've got red legs. And if you were to see them in flight, one of the cues that you might notice is that white eye arc. So behind the eye, there's a nice white arc. And then if you look at the leading edge of the wing, you can see that although you've got black tip of the wing, that leading edge is white. So those are good cues for in-flight, which can be very useful with gulls because they don't always settle down when you want them to. Okay, so next we get into the basic quintessential gull species, and that is the ring-billed gull. So this is our most common, widely seen gull. It is the gull you're most likely to see away from the coast, so they'll happily nest inland near freshwater, and they are opportunistic foragers. So they will eat fish, but they will also eat insects, rodents, garbage. They love McDonald's French fries. So there you go. Parking lot of a McDonald's, good chance it's a ring-billed gull. Two of the characteristics that we can use to identify them are not visible in this picture. So they too have black wingtips. And then remember I said the color of the legs is really important. So yellow-green legs for a ring-billed gull. They have a nice pale back. They have a pale eye, almost a yellowish eye. And then, as probably you could guess from the name, they have a short yellow bill that has that distinctive dark ring around it. These guys are a pretty small gull. They are bigger than our black-legged kittiwakes, but smaller than just about everything else we're talking about today. Okay, one of our larger gulls is the herring gull. And herring gull populations, they have increased fairly dramatically during the last century for a couple of reasons. One, because the species gained legal protection from hunting. And two, is that its food source, which happens to be human waste and fishing discards, increased pretty dramatically as well. So after the closure of the cod fishery in the 90s here in Newfoundland, their populations did decrease here because they lost one of their major food sources, that fishing discards, but the populations are now stable. So for these guys, you'll notice right away the pink legs. So that is a good giveaway for the herring gull. You've got a white head, a pale gray back, you've got black wingtips, but with white spots. And then those pink legs. And again, the overall size. So that's really useful when you're trying to figure out gulls, particularly because we do have a lot of ring-billed gulls. We also have a lot of herring gulls. And so if you're just sort of getting an idea of the size, ring-billed gulls are much smaller. Now, some of you may notice that I have not mentioned what looks like maybe one of the most distinguishing characteristics of the gull, and that is that red spot on its bill. And there are a couple of reasons I didn't mention it in the last slide. One is that it's not particularly diagnostic. So it's actually common to many gull species. But also, I wanted to talk a little bit about it because I am a behavioral ecologist at heart. So I studied the science of animal behavior. I've always been fascinated by it. And it turns out that that red spot is singularly important in the birth of the entire field of study of animal behavior. So in the mid-20th century, a Dutch scientist called Nico Tinbergen, who is known as one of the fathers of animal behavior, he noticed that when gull chicks begged for food from their parents, they pecked at the adults' bills, and then the adults would regurgitate food for them. And so Tinbergen did some experiments where he varied the shape and the coloration of the adult's bill and messed around with that red spot. And what he found out through process of elimination, basically, was that the red spot was an essential visual cue to prompt the chick's behavior. So if you take away the red spot, the chicks won't peck at the bill, and if they don't peck at the bill, they won't get fed. So in 1973, Tinbergen was actually awarded the Nobel Prize for his research, partly for the work that he did with gulls and in demonstrating the importance of the red spot. So I think that's kind of a fun story to know, but it's also good to remember that that red spot is not diagnostic of a particular species. And this is a good example because you can see the red spot on our final breeding gull species, which is the great black-backed gull. And this is the largest gull in the world. So it is a seriously large, powerful bird. It's got a lot of attitude. It feeds mainly on fish and marine invertebrates, but it will scavenge from other sources, and that includes the eggs and the chicks of other seabirds. So when you see seabirds nesting in colonies, you'll often see great black-backed gulls hanging around waiting for a parent to leave their chick or their egg alive. Here in Newfoundland, we do have large breeding colonies, including in Witless Bay and Hare Bay Islands. And hopefully the name of this gull, the great black-backed gull, gives a major cue to one of the most important field marks for identifying it. And that is, of course, the dark wings and the black and the back, the black back of it. Size is another really important one here. So this is a really stocky gull with a thick neck and heavy bill. It's quite large. It has pink legs. It's also got white spots on the wingtips, so both of those are like the herring gull, but it's much larger than the herring gull, and it does have that dark back, which is a really good way of identifying it. It acquires those dark wings and back by the age of 4. Juvenile great black-backed gulls do actually resemble herring gulls, but they're just much, much bigger. And happily, gulls often do stand next to each other, so different species are often found standing next to each other, which does make size sometimes a more useful cue in identifying them. Okay, and after that whirlwind tour of the seabirds, we are going to finish off with our terns, our 3 species of terns. So these guys are a little bit like gulls, but they're smaller, more slender, more agile. They've got longer pointed wings. And one of the classic things you may see terns doing is hovering in the air right over the surface of the water before they dive for food. So these guys are common terns. And the distinguishing features you can see there, you've got that nice slender body, which distinguishes it from a gull, black cap, an overall gray body with dark gray wingtips, got a nice forked tail there. But it's worth noting that the wingtip and the tail are approximately the same length. So that's easy to see in the tern on the bottom there. And then they've got an orange-red bill, which during the breeding season has that dark tip. Our second species of tern, the Arctic tern, looks superficially quite a bit like the common tern, and distinguishing between the two of them is the two species is actually quite difficult. But it can be easier if they're sitting there like that. So it's a shorter bill on the Arctic tern, and it's red as opposed to orange with the dark tip. And then they also have shorter legs, so they have these little squat legs that are red instead of orange. And their tail, this is not a great shot to see this, but their tail is quite a bit longer, so it actually extends beyond the wingtips. It's also worth noting that when you've got the common tern, you've got a little bit more of a dark gray, and the Arctic tern is a little bit of a lighter gray. But it is indeed very, very difficult to distinguish between these two. And because, as I said, I'm an animal behavior person and specifically a migration person, I could not talk about Arctic terns without just quickly mentioning their migration. So they are known for their incredibly long migration. They travel from their Arctic breeding grounds to Antarctica each year. So here in North America, birds cover around 40,000 kilometers each year, which is already pretty mind-boggling. But in 2013, scientists put trackers on Arctic terns in the Netherlands. And what they discovered is that these birds have an even longer migration. So they travel across 3 oceans. They use staging areas in the Indian Ocean and the Southern Oceans that we didn't know anything about. And then they go to Antarctica. So in total, birds from the Netherlands actually traveled about an average of 90,000 kilometers during the non-breeding season. And so that is the longest bird migration known. So we have a little map of that, and you can see that they're coming from Europe there and going around Africa and all the way across to just beneath Australia there. So they've got an incredible migration. And we've got one more species of tern, and that is the Caspian tern. These guys are much, much bigger than Arctic terns and common terns. So the first thing that's really going to stand out with them is their size and this crazy carrot nose that they have. So it really does look like somebody's taken the nose off a snowman and plonked it on their faces. They too have a black cap and a forehead. They have dark legs and feet. So if you're able to see the legs and feet, that will distinguish them quite easily from common and Arctic terns. And they've got darker wings. So you can see the top of the wingtip there. Underneath it is quite dark in comparison to our much lighter common and Arctic terns. But again, it's not really something that you'll ever need to use because this is a tern that's really almost the size of a gull. And it's got that really obvious carrot nose. So these guys are by far our easiest tern species to identify. Okay, so that is our whirlwind tour of the seabirds tonight. We've gone through all of our breeding species here and a couple that don't breed here. And so what we're going to do now is finish off with our little quiz. So we are basically going to give you a chance to show off your knowledge. I have 5 pictures of seabird species that we talked about today. And for each species, I'm going to launch a poll and tell me what you think it is. And as I said, answers are anonymous. It's all just for fun. But let's see what we learned tonight. So this is our first species here. And just give me a minute to remind myself of poll launching. Come on now. There we go. Okay. Okay, so you should be able to see the poll window now, and you can submit your answers. And if the poll is blocking your view of the picture, you can actually drag the window across and move it. Okay. Excellent. We're seeing great participation here. I love that. Okay, we'll shut it down in about 10 more seconds. So if anybody has a last minute guess, promise you're not getting graded on this. It's just for fun. So feel free to submit it. Okay, calling for last guesses now. And I'm going to end the poll. Okay, so I'm sharing the results here. 47 people answered, which is awesome. And nobody thought this was a razorbill, so well done. Its bill is far too small and thin for a razorbill. It's a little bit too big for a guillemot. And as you remember, the guillemots are all black with those white wing patches. So this white breast disqualifies it from being a guillemot. You can't see its feet, so it is a little bit of a trick question, because if you could see that they weren't red, that would be an easy giveaway. So the question is, which species of murre do we have here? And so most people said common murre, and a few people said thick-billed murre. They are super difficult to distinguish. However, it does not have that white line along the upper bill. And you can see that there's a nice smooth edge between the white and the black there, and more of a black neck. So if it were a thick-billed murre, you would see white on its bill, a little bit of a milk mustache there, basically, and you would see that the white of its breast came to a sharp point rather than that nice smooth line. So 72% of people got that correct. It is, in fact, a common murre. Okay, so let's see if I can go on to our next question. What do we have here? Okay, taking answers. All right, just a few more seconds. Any last minute guesses coming in? Speak now or forever hold your peace. All right, so we'll end this one. And wow, you guys are kind of experts here. So everybody knew that it was a cormorant. Well done. That's that long, almost snaky neck, and the hooked bill tells you right away that's a cormorant. Which species? This is kind of a tricky one. So if you remember, there's white on the great cormorant and not on the double-crested cormorant, but this is in fact a double-crested cormorant, and it is actually a younger double-crested cormorant. So juvenile double-crested cormorants have a lighter chest and neck than the adults, but they don't have that distinct white patch under the chin. So it does have, I agree, lighter plumage under the chin there. It definitely looks, I can see why it would be easy to mistake for a great cormorant. But in this case, that's just sort of a lighter gray as opposed to a distinct white patch. If you knew where this picture was taken, you could also use location as a cue. Because remember, the double-crested cormorants are really the only ones that are likely to be found inland. Okay, we got 3 to go, and I'm very impressed so far. All right, so what do we have here? Okay, a few more seconds. Get your votes in. Remember, just for fun. Okay, any last minute votes? All right, we'll end the poll. So this one was a little bit trickier. We've got our 3 species of terns and a dovekie. So it's kind of, it's both too slim and too big to be a dovekie, if that makes sense. So dovekies are the ones that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology described as flying billiard balls, basically. They're very round with a very short little bill. So it's one of our terns. And we've got a Caspian, a common, and an Arctic here. It's not a Caspian tern because it doesn't have that gigantic carrot nose. This is something that you probably could tell very easily out in the field just by the size of it. It looks the same size as a gull almost when you're looking at a Caspian tern. It's a lot harder to tell from a photo. So then we have a split between common tern and Arctic tern. And as I said, those species are very difficult to tell apart. This guy is in fact an Arctic tern. And the cues to recognize that, a big one is those little short red legs, really stubby legs it's got there. You've also got a red bill as opposed to that orange bill. And then this is very hard to tell from the angle of the photos, but the tail does extend past the wingtip. So Arctic terns have that long tail. So we had a pretty much even split between common and Arctic tern here, and that one is definitely difficult. Okay, so we'll do our next species, second last. Who do we have here? Okay, a few more seconds. People seem a bit more unsure of this one. We've got fewer participants. Anyone want to get their last minute guess in? A few more. Calling all answers. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. Okay, so fulmar, black-legged kittiwake, ring-billed gull, or northern gannet. Well, fulmars, if you remember, are those procellular. You know what? I'm not even going to go there today. I can't say it. Tube noses. So you have a pretty good view of the bill on this bird, and you don't see that tube nose. So it's not a fulmar. It's also a little bit too dainty, really, to be a fulmar. Those are pretty stocky birds. It's got much too small a bill to be a gannet. So even though it does have those black wingtips, the bill is just not at all like a dagger. It's also nesting right on the edge of a cliff. So that's an interesting context cue to keep in mind. So is it a ring-billed gull or a black-legged kittiwake? Well, it does not have a ring on its bill. You can't see its feet, so that does take away one of our cues. If you could, you would see that it does indeed have black legs as opposed to the yellow-green legs of a ring-billed gull. But ring-billed gulls are our next smallest gull after this guy. So it is an easy mistake to make. Luckily, during the breeding season, we can use that ring around the bill to distinguish between them. Okay, so 78% of you got that. Amazing. We have one more question. And here it is. So what do we have here? Okay, get your guesses in. Last question of the night. %70 participation. Can we bump it up a little bit more? Any more guesses? All right, I will end the poll. Okay, so here we have 3 species of gull. the herring gull, the ring-billed gull, and the great black-backed gull, and a northern fulmar. And so all of them got a few guesses, but with the herring gull and the ring-billed gull, the important thing to remember is they don't have dark backs. So they don't have those dark colored backs. So then we're really down to the great black-backed gull and the northern fulmar. And it is a little bit hard to tell. Both are pretty large birds. This guy's pretty stocky though. So really a pretty stocky gull-like bird. And then you've also got, if you can look closely enough, you can see the little tube nose. And so this guy is, and I'm going to say this because I've mangled it so many times tonight, and I think I've got my tongue around it now. He's a procellariform. So he does have that tube nose. You can also see that he's got that nice thick neck and that dark eye smudge that makes him a northern fulmar. Okay, so 70% got that right. You guys did amazing. Obviously, you were all taking many notes because everybody learned a lot about seabirds tonight, or knew a lot about seabirds to start off with. I will just put up a few resources here. If you are looking to learn a little bit more about our birds here in Newfoundland, so Nature NL has a checklist of the birds of insular Newfoundland that I believe you can buy for them for $2. So if you're here in Newfoundland and you're looking to kind of check things off as you see them, that's a very useful resource to have. Bird the Rock, which is run by our friend Jared Clark. It's a birding tourism organization. He also keeps a checklist of the birds of Newfoundland, an unofficial checklist. And then there's a book called The Birds of Newfoundland, a really great field guide by Ian Workington and Sandy Newton. And you can also use, Jenna mentioned last week, the Sibley Guide as one of the guides with painted birds. And so Sibley Birds East is a useful guide as well. And with that, we'll say thank you for coming again this week. I hope that we will see some of you guys out next week when we're talking about ducks. And there's some resources there, so feel free to email us at nlatlas@birdscanada.org if you have any questions or comments. And if there's anything in the chat, I'm happy to share or happy to attempt to answer. Otherwise, thanks everyone for coming out, and see you next week.
Thanks, Catherine. That was very informative. And I learned something every time, I feel like. We're having a lot of things coming into the chat. People can feel free to put in any questions they have if they want, or unmute to ask a question. And I'll just ask one in the meantime that came in near the beginning, which was, are there certain conditions that are needed for colony formation for seabirds? So is there things like landscape or food sources or anything like that that's important to create a colony?
That's a really good question. And it's something that off the top of my head is kind of hard to answer, because a lot of the colonies we have here have been colonies for so long that it's difficult to say what exactly brought them together. One of the things I know that is important for birds in general when they're choosing where to nest is indications that other birds have been successful there. So in that way, a colony is kind of a positive feedback loop, where the more birds are there, the more successful young are there, the more other birds are going to be attracted to breed there, because it's obvious that the necessities for successful breeding are in place already. But also the proximity to food sources is indeed important. And that is possibly the reason that some of these colonies are going to find themselves in trouble with climate change as food distributions shift a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll also just add, as like a more general idea for where seabird colonies are, is typically they're in areas that are inaccessible to land-based predators. And so usually we're talking about offshore islands for that reason, or also those steep cliffs, because foxes, for example, can't get to them.
That is a very good point. Unfortunately, we also sometimes, humans have been known to introduce predators to some of these islands that did not historically host predators. And so that can also cause a lot of problems for seabirds.
Yeah, that's a good point. Angus is asking about any comments on the effects of avian flu.
Ooh, that's a big topic, and one that I am not especially qualified to address, although I will point out also on our website, we have a webinar from the fall of 2022 by Bill Montevecchi, who was talking about avian influenza in particular. A lot of our seabird colonies here in Newfoundland have been hit extremely hard by HPAI, highly pathogenic avian influenza. And seabirds in particular are vulnerable to it because they breed in such large numbers all close together. We did notice a lot of effects on murres. We noticed a lot of effects on gannets. So a couple of summers ago, the bird rock at Cape St. Mary's, which is home to thousands of gannets, was a little bit of a sad sight. There were a lot of dead birds on the rock. Other species, particularly those that nest in burrows, so things like the puffins and the storm petrels, the last I heard, they actually tended to be less affected by avian influenza. And that could just be the sort of separation. You know, if you're nesting in a burrow, you're not sort of edge to edge with another nest. But I think the jury is still out on what the ultimate impacts of avian influenza will be on our seabird colonies here. And I would definitely recommend checking out that webinar that Bill gave for us about 1.5 years ago, because it was very informative.
I popped the link into the chat for where our webinars are housed, and you can find it there.
Yeah,
here's
you just
another.
Need to scroll down because they're underneath all of the bird ID ones.
Yeah. Somebody's asking also what could be the effects of wind turbines in our province to birds, which is a big question these days. So Catherine, I don't know if you want to speak about that a little.
Again, that's not something that I'm super qualified to speak about. I do know that so birds and wind turbines can be a problem. Maybe not as much of a problem as it is for some other types of animals like bats. Wind turbines are actually quite dangerous for bats. People don't tend to put up wind turbines in the middle of seabird colonies. So that is a little bit of a saving grace. I think, as you can see from that picture there, a wind turbine right in the middle of a seabird colony could be potentially problematic. When people build wind turbines, they do usually do surveys both before and after they build them to try and get a sense of avian mortality. But that's a huge question, and I would say it probably depends on where the wind turbines are placed, what the flight paths of the birds are, whether safety precautions are taken. So in some cases, you can program the turbines to turn off when there's a wind that would be particularly favorable to migration at a time when migration would be happening. So I think the answer is that it's pretty varied impacts.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. That's a really nuanced topic, and one that would be a big, long conversation, I think, to get really into it. I don't see any other questions coming in right now. So if there aren't any last minute questions, then we'll just say thank you everyone for coming again, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Yeah, and thanks again.
All right, thanks a lot, Jenna. Thanks, Jenna and Belle, for monitoring the questions. And yeah, hope to see you all next week. Have a good night, everyone.
Have a good night.